real pleasure to have Krzysztof Miński. Yes. Because Krzysztof is kind of a strange name in Mexico. It's either Chris or Stefan, but Krzysztof is a, so I have to think about gluing these two words together. So Krzysztof Miński, he is going to give a talk about complex systems from the artist point of view. So please.
Key checker, yep, okay. So yeah, thanks for, very much for having me here and flying me all the way over from Australia. As Max already pointed out, my name is of a few different descents, but it comes from also my Belarusian heritage. But also a lot of the content I'll be playing today comes from the work I've done for 10 years in Austria. So if I'm talking about Austria and Australia, just not to get too confused, that's the reason. I am Australian, but I've been in Austria for many years. I did actually come here with a very specifically prepared presentation on art and robotics. However, over the last 3 days, I've been so inspired by all of these other talks and really thinking about the place where I'm kind of located and where I'm sitting, and this idea of complexity and transdisciplinarity, which is something that I work in quite a lot. So I've decided to mix up the whole presentation, and I pretty much started from scratch. And there's still robotics in there, so for those who are purely here for the robotics, I will be showing some examples, and I'm happy to provide a lot more content if that's what you were specifically interested in. I have to say, I've been a little bit puzzled by this term complexity and how it's applied. I was trying to get a decent translation from the introductory pamphlet here. So, but what I really liked is that I get all that notion of complexity from the scientific perspective, complex systems and separation, objects interacting and this type of thing. But I think it's also, from my perspective, very applicable from the idea of the human-centric position and how I apply this to my own research in transdisciplinarity. And I think it actually connects very well with the type of work that we're doing in the Ars Electronica Future Lab. So I hope that this talk can really inspire some of the people that are connected to the center here about this approach that we take with art and whether there might be opportunities for us to further connect in the future. So just a little bit of a background about myself. I've been somewhat of an experimental artist since the early 2000s. I've worked across a very broad range of mediums. I have formal training in music and media communication. I've worked in television and film production. But I also just started to experiment and play around with all kinds of things. Electronics, I was pulling apart computers since I was a young boy. Then I started to apply this into my work and into my art. And as a result, I've done a lot of different things. And one thing that's always a common thread is that I was never a solo artist. I've always worked with people. I've collaborated, and usually with people from a very broad spectrum of skills. Then around 2009, my kind of artistic hackery got a little bit more serious, and I found myself at the Ars Electronica Future Lab, which is overtly described as one of the most sort of reputable and long-lasting dedicated transdisciplinary research institutes with a clear and definite focus on the artistic research perspective. The other thing I wanted to say, and I guess I touched on that briefly, is apart from being inspired, I also found myself surrounded by a lot of other presenters here who obviously come from a very high level of training and expertise in the science field. So I'm not a scientist. As I say, I've just dipped and dabbled in different things. I'm definitely somewhat of an uncredentialed technologist. But I can also say that also because of my work at the Future Lab, I have worked alongside very highly trained scientists, and my expertise really over the last 5 years has been producing and leading teams of people from a variety of high-level expertise across disciplines and trying to find a language of how we can connect and work together. Just a little bit of an overview about the Future Lab. It's a very broad spectrum of projects. I'm only going to show a very small cross-section today. We work with many different partners from very large corporations, cultural partners, academic institutes from all over the world, and also leading scientific partners and institutes, mostly in Europe. I mentioned it before, but this is, I think, really one of the key aspects of what the Future Lab is about and what it has been doing for and not only a long time, I think, in terms of this notion of experimental art, which others have been working in the same field for many years, but actually with a dedicated and large concentrated team doing it every day in the same space. So it's not a transdisciplinary team coming together for a project and then coming together and going away. It's a dedicated team that's constantly been working in this space. And I have a number of employees, I would say more than half of the Future Lab, that have been there for over 10 years. And there's a number of those people that have been there right from the beginning. So it's an extremely experienced and dedicated team that's focusing in this area. And this is kind of the mantra of what we like to consider in terms of our scientific, artistic, and social connection points, this nexus between the art, the technology, and the society. Sorry. No, it's Die Lust am Experiment, for the love of the experiment. This was the heading, the subheading, the first proposal for the Future Lab as it went to the city. And another interesting point about that, Horst Hortner, who's the founder and director and also somebody I'm very close with, who I've worked under the mentorship for many years, started there at the Future Lab and he was halfway through a bachelor degree. So he's often invited nowadays to go and talk at very high level at institutions. He's adjunct professor for a number of other universities, but Horst himself came to the lab without even a university degree, but a very strong vision of the idea of the type of work that he was interested in doing. And finally, my second last hat that I wear is I'm also a PhD candidate and a researcher, very close to finishing my PhD, which is all about this topic, as I touched on before. I'm exploring collaboration in experimental art. I'm very much looking at the applied work that I've been doing, so the projects are my case studies, and I've developed a model that I continue to work on, which I'll be going into a little bit more detail about later. Just to mention that my research is often associated with these types of what I would say contradictory terms as I've gone through my research, but nevertheless, it's useful and can be applied across a range of different areas. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit more broadly about the Ars Electronica to give some context, because I also realize after a few days here of talking to people, no one's really got much of an idea about what the Ars Electronica is. So I thought it would be good to introduce this briefly. So the Ars Electronica started and continues as a festival. It started in 1979 as a festival that's concentrated at the intersection of art and technology and society. Around the mid-80s, the pre-Ars Electronica was established, which is still today one of the most world-renowned awards in the area of cyber arts. So it covers categories such as computer animation, hybrid arts, interactive art, and so on and so forth. I'll show some examples from the pre a little bit later on. In 1996, it was a fairly critical milestone, because the festival and the pre went from being kind of this sort of niche, elite-focused area to having a permanent centre based in Linz and interacting with the society on a daily basis. And importantly, that's also when the Future Lab was launched. So the Future Lab was actually a byproduct of the decision to establish the centre. And once they had decided to establish a centre, they had to then fill it with content that they soon realised would not be possible just to pick and choose from what was out there. They essentially had to develop a lab in order to do this kind of work. And just a few other little milestones there along the way. That's when I started at Ars Electronica. Well, they were building the new Ars Electronica Centre in 2008. And probably most importantly, from my perspective, is as of this year, it's the first time that Ars Electronica has established and launched an Ars Electronica outside of Austria. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later on, but I won't focus on that too much in this presentation. So this was the festival theme this year, and I think that many of the people in the room, from a scientific perspective, can relate to this topic. I was the first Ars Electronica festival that I really participated in was called Repair. That was in 2010, and that had an immense effect on me because I was already quite heavily involved early from my university days in I would say a fairly light type of activism, but I was very interested in this kind of impact of using the art and this social connection point. But what is kind of critical to understand about the festival and the topic that's chosen each year is it's always trying to look for what could be the existing technology or scientific kind of intervention, or sometimes an anomaly or a new discovery that is seen to have quite an incredible impact on the society and the future society. 1990, some of the names you would be familiar with, especially people like Marvin Minsky, one of the real sort of pioneers in the computational systems work. This topic around virtual reality, which is going back, more than almost 2 decades, is concentrated on topics that are still relevant today as we see the first, I think, main rollout in the last couple of years of these much more commercially accessible units. And here's just a few other examples over the years. Some of you may be familiar with Stellark, of course, a fellow Australian who was, I think, somewhat ostracized for his work in Australia when he first started, but he was celebrated in Ars Electronica in Linz, a real kind of pioneer of cybernetics, and he was creating experiments that he wouldn't have been able to do on himself at that time. This is a work where he was being remotely controlled via a network in his own robotic contraption that he'd built himself. 2003, these are fantastic Japanese instrument inventors called Maiwa Denki. Some of you might know the Otomatoni, which is an instrument that they've developed that has a mouth to change the pitch and a long kind of keyboard that you play with your hands. And one of my personal favorites and heroes, and someone I think that was connected to Mexico City, Michael Nyman, who wrote the book about experimental music in the 70s, which is a very important reference. And here in the corner, I just applied another short video, which is definitely not a pioneer, but a pretty interesting guy that came to Linz a few years ago and was using his body to conduct electricity as part of his Tesla orchestra. And I think he blacked out half of Linz when he was setting it up. So I mentioned the pre before, and here's a couple of examples that from the hybrid art category, which I think for some of you that are also new to Ars Electronica might find interesting. So I think in the hybrid category is where you find the examples of works which are probably really kind of pushing that button of also controversy, but serious scientific research, and also sometimes, as the Cosmopolitan Chicken Project shows, something maybe also with a kind of a light humor, artistic touch to it as well. And I've just prepared one video, which I'll allow to explain itself.
Self is the world's first neural synthesizer. It is an autonomous instrument that is composed of a brain made of biological neural networks and a body made of analog modular synthesizers that work in synergy. The neural networks are bioengineered from the project's initiator, Guy Benari's cells. There is no programming or computers involved on biological matter and analog circuits. A wetalog instrument. With Self, the musician and musical instrument become one entity to create a cybernetic musician, a rock star in a petri dish. Benari's adolescent dream to become a rock star. This long-standing passion for music, combined with 16 years of research exploring artistic embodiment of bioengineered brains, laid the foundation for creating the cybernetic self-portrait. Like David Bowie creating Ziggy Stardust, Benari created Self as his rock star alter ego. Self is the result of a collaborative effort involving artists, engineers, and scientists. Contextualizing them within an artistic framework. It started with a new materialist question underpinned by the belief that artistic practice can act as a vector for thought. What is the potential for artworks using biological technologies to evoke responses in regards to the shifting perceptions surrounding the understanding of life and the materiality of the human body?
So I will jump through some of these videos just to keep it short, but I can also supply all of these links afterwards as an appendix to the video that is being recorded. Just to mention that Guy's part of what I think is definitely one of Australia's, but really one of the world's premier institutes that's working at the intersection between biology and art. It's based in the University of Western Australia. It's headed by a guy called Oren Katz, and they've been working in this field for around 20 years. So this is actually just one early example of a number of which have also been either winners or honorary mentions or awards of distinctions in the pre-Ars Electronica. Another important impact of Ars Electronica, particularly in the context of this science, technology, arts nexus, was the development of the European Union STARTS Award. Here's a nice example. I actually haven't seen myself. I just found it today on my wife's recommendation, Maria Jose, who had seen it at the festival a few years ago. But this type of work, which is exploring, in this case, something between DNA sequencing and an idea of a post-human type of music making. The award is around €20,000. It's got a number of funding partners across the country. It has European Union-based funding, and it's also a really nice one to take a look at if you're interested in also maybe blending some of your work with arts, or if you're already working in this space. It's a really great award. With a lot of the slides, I'm putting up the web references, but again, I will make those more clearly available at the end. Another important aspect to Ars Electronica is the development of several very important art residency programs. Probably the most significant was the program we developed, the first art program we developed with CERN. And this is now today not part of a residency program. They have a completely dedicated art space within CERN, which is managed and directed by the original collaborator that we developed the program with. A great program, and attracted really some of the highest recognized media artists in the world. And here's an example with Ryoji Akita. For those who don't know his work, he's a magnificent visual media artist from Japan. So now I'll just talk a little bit more about the Ars Electronica, the Centre, the Future Lab, the overall organization, and in particular some of the works that I think are both very important, but also the projects, including the mega projects, starting with the Ars Electronica Centre, that I hope can help to communicate this approach that we're taking in this space between the art and the science. So this is the modern Ars Electronica Centre. It was the first centre museum to really develop a focus on this idea of the labs. Down here in the corner, you see our bio lab. That's Steph and a colleague who kind of switches sometimes between working together on a future lab research project. If we decide to collaborate with someone in the museum, he's a trained and well-educated biologist. He's doing workshops from plant cloning. We have an S-certified DNA sequencing machine in this biolab. So he's really crossing a very broad spectrum of biological scientific application, mixed with, of course, I haven't got any examples there, but I'll show some others outside that lab where you're moving more than into this fusion between art, playing around with the bio approach. This is an excerpt from our small robotics lab, I originally was going to talk a bit more about that. It's very hands-on, so we really want the people to get in, to play around with the concept of robotics, to make things, to pull things apart. We have very simple but very interesting works that focus on, I think, one of the really main important topics of what Ars Electronica is about, and it's human-machine communication design, and how we can bring people closer to the idea of understanding some of these vital concepts for their own modern times, but also for their future. So this is a little bit of a mantra that is thrown around. Some may disagree with this, but I think in terms of the approach that the centre takes, it's very much the way that we do approach things. So we have a deeply embedded respect for the science, for the hard science, and we try to bring this into the space and use art as a way to create an experience, as another way to understand the knowledge. I also just wanted to mention, seeing as I'm here and today, again, going over to the Universum, and how the Future Lab is working in this context of having a Future Lab centre, but then right next to it we have a museum, which we have a contact with the daily life. And that's a very nice mechanism to be able to use. So just thinking about this interest from C3 and moving more into this art science intersection, that may be something of interest also, to look at how we're using our centre as a kind of a test bed. Some of you might know Hiroshi Ishiguro. He's a master of one of the more realistic style of robots. That's a replicate of himself, the Geminoid series. And this is our cafe restaurant in the museum. We had a week-long series of experiments where, I'll just try to play that one again, where we had Ishiguro as a resident in the center, and we were replacing the real Ishiguro sometimes with the robotic Ishiguro, and so on. So it was quite very, very playful. For those who don't know, Ishiguro, as he's got older, his robot's not aging, so he tries to, really work now to make himself look younger and more like his robot. He's an interesting character. This is a fantastic project, and for me, one that really accentuates this role of Ars Electronica and its place within this complex system of LINS, and how it can connect to academia, how it can connect to the industries, how it's useful definitely for the citizens. So it's a project that began with Siemens and their photoimagery technology. It employed a kind of a reworking, a hack of cinematic rendering techniques. And it's displayed in one of our kind of cornerstone exhibits inside the Ars Electronica Centre. It's called the Deep Space. It's a 16 by 9 meter wall and floor environment, all in 8K. It also has stereoscopic capabilities, and it's completely motion tracked, which isn't relevant for this particular work. But here you can see some of the quality of the images. These images are coming real time through the relationship of the other, the AKH Allgemeines Haus LINS, with real-time body scan data, of course, from patients who allow for their body data to be used. And then here you have one of the leading professors from the Joseph Kepler University with his students and other researchers in the space, being able to have an experience with the type of medium they've been working with for a long time in a way that they've never been capable of. So this has been an extremely successful project, so much so that the university is dedicating a whole new kind of research team dedicated to this particular topic, and even building a whole new infrastructure around that. Meanwhile, you have a room of experts. They'll go out, and the next moment you'll have the daily life come in and get an introduction into the world of anatomy. So as you can see, it's in that space where we're kind of playing between the highest level of science, using art as a way to provide a kind of a new mechanisms, not mechanisms for the scientists themselves, but also very much still concentrated on how do we communicate with the daily life of the people, the citizens of Linz and the visitors into the Ars Electronica Centre. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about how we're also working with industry. It's also a very important aspect to what the Future Lab is doing, because it's primarily how we fund our activities. The Future Lab is not part of a university. We work with many universities. It does have a very unique qualification as a research institute in Austria, so it is also capable of receiving and does receive fairly significant funding for some of its programs. But primarily it comes from our industry cooperations. And also, just to mention, this was, I think, the first of one of the most important aspects to Ars Electronica in the Future Lab's approach, is that innovation was never a purpose. It was more of a consequence of how it was going about doing what it was doing, and then the industry started to get interested in that. And that happened very quickly after the development of the Future Lab and the Ars Electronica Center. SAP, this is a great example. This was a cafe that opened, I think, 2 years ago in Berlin. SAP, one of the biggest software companies in the world. They've got, I think, the biggest data reserve in the world, in a country that has one of the strictest data laws in the world. And this was a cafe that was set up as a kind of futuristic cafe for collaboration, business, innovation, but it was also exploring some of those topics as an installation, as an exhibition to do with big data. But it's also a great example because SAP has been a collaborator since, I think, going back since 2004. And I'll just play this video a little bit. This was from 2007, and it's another landmark project from the Ars Electronica Future Lab. Essentially what you're seeing there, that's the SAP headquarters. That's in Walldorf in Germany. I think Walldorf is about 15,000 people and 10,000 work at the SAP. So it's a small German village, SAP village, basically. And being such a large, multi-global company, they're often having big delegations of visitors that are coming into this small town. And there was just this big kind of grey concrete jungle structure, which was the headquarters. So they worked with the Future Lab to develop a guidance system, which was a project that lasted over several years. And what you're seeing here is some of the very, for me, quite early and interesting examples, at least, of other things that I've researched of a computer vision, pre some of the more readily available computer vision technologies that are available today. They were using real-time data packets that were coming out of the workflow, and those creatures that you're seeing, they're made of data packets, and then those data packets would connect themselves to visitors that would enter the center and help guide them. They would get their own personal creature, which would help guide them through the building depending on where they wanted to go. It also just shows for me, the scope of some of the work that we're doing and how much is required from high-level structural engineering, from computer programming, from data analytics. I think that was around 50 feet high, this steeler that was put in.
These are the days, my friends. It could get some gasoline shortest. Make a Toyota. These are the days of my friends. And these are the days you catch the back of the wheel. It gets a wheel for the sailboat. And it could get. Do you remember this? It could get the railroad for these. With the railroad. It could be in the blues. It would be great. It would be very fresh.
And there you can see the nighttime features. So that was one of the first uses of the pulse interface, and the user would come in, and that's how the installation would start in the nighttime, and the user's pulse would start pumping through this installation, through the screens that were specifically designed and created to have water flowing above them, which nowadays is not so uncommon, but back then it was quite difficult. And also one of the engineering challenges just to get the water to flow up the stream and into the building. I think I missed him back here. This is Zach Lieberman, for those who don't know. He was an ex-member of the Future Lab for a while, and he's one of the the really highly recognized creative coders in the world. He developed the open framework system, which some of you may know if you're working in this space. A more recent project, which is very well known, I would say by now, the SPAX. It's a research project that started on this topic of investigation of the space and the pixel in space. It's also, for me, a really important project back in this idea of innovation as a consequence. This was started more of an arts for art's sake kind of endeavor. So I think importantly, as I'll describe when I get back to my model, that there's collaboration going on even when we don't have a dedicated project to work on. This is what I kind of describe in the difference of a truly collaborative space, more around the idea of an art thinking to a design thinking, very point of departure, team-based work that we do. So it started here. It was the first launch in 2012 for a river festival in Austria, and very quickly it was seen to be quite a groundbreaking, I would say, quite a masterpiece of media art. It was, I think, a few weeks later, Horst was in contact with, what was his name? The director of Star Wars that time, J.J. Abrams, and he wanted to do it as part of a premiere launch next to London Bridge, which was a fascinating project to be involved in, because we've gone from this purely experimental work to all of a sudden we've got a big corporate client, we've got to get to London and put on a show. The next few iterations that I was quite heavily involved in was to take it to Australia. And something I'm very proud of was that because of this art project, we were able to redevelop CASA legislation, the Civil Aviation Service Authority in Australia, that allowed for researchers that we were partnered with to help get this clearance do some of what is now very groundbreaking important research to do with swarm technology across issues to do with firefighting or marine conservation. So in this way, I think it's a nice example, but it was also an absolute nightmare. I was at 6 months dealing with massive manuscripts and manuals that had to be prepared. But it was also super important because later that was the same process that was used to get the first FAA approvals to do the same in the States, where we partnered with Intel.
When you think about it, future is the only thing that can be created. Everything else is created already. So it is actually a driving force. Call it curiosity, call it hope, that gets you things done that never have been done before. That was the idea of the drone swarmer.
Coming home?
The drones that we fly, we call them spaxels, the space pixels. It was really trying to achieve a 3D display. As soon as you call them drones, people immediately think dangerous, but it isn't really. It can be beautiful. Ars Electronica is concentrating on the intersection of art, technology, and our society. So really focusing on the future of our society by the means of artistic use of technologies. When Intel came and said, what about doing 100 drones? Oh, nobody did it yet. Nobody even tried it. And it's just like, yes, let's go for it.
Let's flip through to some of the actual first presentation of Intel.
Everybody ready?
All drones switched on.
This was done at a first test with Intel at an abandoned airstrip in a small area of western Germany. But they still agreed to get a nice little orchestra there, which was fantastic. So yeah, that was then. Not too long after that, Intel went and started their own endeavor, and this is the result, which some of you may be familiar with. They also recently did the cover of Time magazine, I think, with 1,300. I think it was around 1,300 drones, with the drone age as the title. So yeah, for me, like, I think it's a fantastic example of, we didn't start with Intel. We actually did that as an artistic endeavor, and we didn't have the luxury of having so much money in a big industry to support that research, but we pushed and we drove, and it does show that it is possible for that type of work to lead to something quite incredible, and it's really a benchmark project now for Intel in terms of the work that they do and how they promote their technology and their inspiration about working with technology and creativity in the future. Just also for those who are interested, I did hear some of the talks, I think not directly, but they're interested in swarm research, behaviors, and this is a new initiative that has been launched once most of the Intel work started to head in different directions. We have jumped off onto a different thread, so we're very much focused now back on this research initiative, and it's much broader now. We're working with also a combination of different types of mostly robotic swarm behaviors, but it's also being employed in other ways, and we have partners such as Autodesk and even NTT, one of the big telecommunication giants from Japan, are involved in this one. And we're starting to get a number of universities that are doing specific research in swarm behavior involved in that as well. A quick reference to MIT Media Lab. This was lifted as a slide from Hiroshi Ishii, and I think it reflects very well the type of work and the type of approach that we're also doing in the Future Lab. And just incidentally, I think in terms of my research and thinking about, as I mentioned before, other examples that have been concentrated on this work and this intersection with art and science, there's probably even a better example than MIT Media Lab, and their history and the association of how they basically built and carved out their own new kind of world inside an academic environment, I think is also quite fascinating. These next two videos show a little bit about where that swarm research is focused on now. Sorry, it's just a bit loud. But it's also, we do a lot of work with large car companies, mostly German, of course, they're the neighbors right next door. And Mercedes-Benz Daimler is in particular one of our really great partners in this space. So again, this is a focus. That's Martina. She was formerly our colleague specializing in robotics and psychology. That's her background, so very much in that human-robot design communication system. And she's recently now started, she has a professorship again with the Joseph Kepler, who's starting a whole department focused around this idea of robotic and robots and psychology. And just also another really nice example. So a lot of this research was connected to this, which is the F015, which I think 2016, it had come into Linz. So you've got this small town of 180,000 people in Upper Austria. And this prototype for the future self-driving car is coming through the city. And this is what's great about a partner like Daimler. I mean, it's not just we're doing this incredible research, which, truth be told, is also helping to fund all of our activities that we can do in these areas. But they're also, very up for this idea that we want to bring this out into the daily life. We want to break those boundaries around the kind of research that's happening behind the closed doors, and how can we bring a connection into the people as well, so they can understand that a little bit better. And that's also what I try to do as well in Australia when the opportunities arise, to find the kind of projects where we can create an experience for people where they can understand a topic which is definitely having a major effect on their daily life and their future lives, whether it's to do with future work, or for it's really important, everybody loves their car, how they're going to drive on the roads with robots. And this was a nice project that was done in collaboration with QUT and the World Science Festival in Brisbane, and it communicates the same topics, but these are little habuku, I think they're called. They're like little vacuum robots that don't vacuum. They're just floorbots, basically. And we hacked them for the purposes of communicating. And this was one of the topics that came out of the research. This was integrated into the car. So that was the idea that there could be two people standing on the side of the road, but they may not necessarily want to cross the road. So that's something that happens very quickly, like if you're in a regional area, but between a driver and a human, to communicate through eye contact, or maybe the driver's just like, go along. If he stopped or the person doesn't move, you can carry on. But in this type of communication, it's quite complicated. So this was the idea to put a projection system, a high-powered projection system that would project a zebra crossing on the road and then indicate that the person should walk across that. So now I'm a little bit behind time, but I'm kind of wrapping up now to talk about what I think is probably most important of how this relates to the university partners that we're working with. And this is a lot to do with my work and my research and what I've been doing in Australia. So for many years, Ars Electronica Future Lab has been working with academic partners about kind of this idea of exporting our transdisciplinary approach into their kind of academic culture. Most of the time, and most importantly though, it's communicated from us to try to think about something like the Future Lab, where everybody usually comes there already with a highly trained discipline. So it's not like you just come into the Future Lab and then you're automatically transdisciplinary. You need to have a strong discipline before you can transcend beyond that. So we're really thinking about this idea, firstly, that we can help support our academic partners through a way of applying a kind of a complementary layer or complementary activities to their existing and very well structured discipline, expertise and education. This was an important statement that came out of one day out of frustration, mostly to do with my PhD, which he co-supervises. We're not also thinking about artists and scientists working side by side. It doesn't at all function like that in the Future Lab. It's this idea that I think the philosophical framework underneath of how we're understanding knowledge production is actually changing. So art is the common denominator, which is kind of providing the inspiration for the collaboration once we develop the projects. There are, of course, other motivators if that's an industry partner that's coming in. But as I said, we're really pushing this approach of not trying to develop solutions, but rather come up with the new questions. These are early sketches. This is one from my partner in the lab from Japan, Hideaki Ogawa. This was for me when I first came into Australia, and the STEM and STEAM debate was really, amping up. And then I think the next thing I heard was theme, that you would bring in humanities. So you had science, technologies, humanities, engineering, art, mathematics. And it's like, well, how long do you want the acronym to be? Like it's kind of getting a little bit pointless and a little bit tiresome. So my approach has been to try to think, how could we approach this in a bit of a different way? And sorry if I keep getting in the way. This is the first iteration of this model that I've been developing. So the blue indicates, as I mentioned, this statement around like art is like water, everything gets wet, was for me really powerful, and it was a good way to start to think about this idea of this collaborative pool. And then as I go through with my research, I map projects to this work, which I'm generally finding is a process more like going in and out of disciplines and then usually back around again. And I'm trying to, through this model, redefine this idea of different types of collaboration. So I think collaboration is just a word that gets thrown around sometimes when it's maybe a different type of process. I think when we're deeply embedded in an industry directed work, it's much more like a cooperative approach, or it's a coordinated approach. We may still be kind of connecting. It might be interdisciplinary, but it's something quite different. So I'm trying to find a way to think about, is this work actually indicating that what is happening is the collaboration before you actually have a purpose to collaborate? And I'm finding interesting colleagues from different universities that are also interested to help explore this a bit further from an academic context. So it's one thing to say we're transdisciplinary because we've got a bunch of people from many different fields writing a paper together and we're publishing that, to actually collaborating in a space where there is really this idea that the disciplines, we're transcending beyond that, and there's another type of collective behavior taking place. This was just something I wanted to throw in. This is probably post-PhD. I like exploring at the agent-based modeling. This is kind of lifted from the PhD, how I draw distinctions between a design thinking and an art thinking space. When does collaboration happen for purpose, and when does it happen for relevance? And when is that also just as important? And this is kind of this digital being, which is lifted from another project called The Soul of the Cube, which could be maybe used as a way. It's a digital being which you have to try to control in order to keep it content. And I've got a video to show this in motion. Let's turn this one right down. This is inside the Queensland University of Technology. It's called The Soul of the Cube, and it's a digital being that's living off its own data from its own technology hardware that it's built into. It's a very complicated multifunctional display system with 52 touch screens and 14 projectors. But it's also living off data that we feed into it from the university. So as an example, we connect to the library and they feed data in about their publications. And that creates a metaphorical mood. If there's not enough publications, then the soul is a little bit depressed maybe. It's connected to the energy consumption of the building, which would then change another metaphorical metaphor. So it's actually quite a complex approach to data visualization, but it's done very much in an artistic way, and I'm keen to explore that. Queensland University of Technology. So probably my biggest collaborator in Australia, but also one that has helped to set up this model. So as I mentioned before, that we're not coming in to try to say, hey, your whole university has to become transdisciplinary. I think that's a really contradictory approach if you really understand what transdisciplinary is about. There's even a university in Australia at the moment that just launched a faculty of transdisciplinary, which is just, it actually doesn't make any sense. So I think the more interesting approaches, and that's what I'm seeing here with C3, is the idea that the universities are starting these other kind of environments which allow for this kind of freedom of exchange and collaboration to take place. So that's essentially how we work with QUT, and we create a range of projects and programs which allow for this type of work to occur. And it's not always in the creative industries. We've been in the science engineering faculty. Next year, they're interested to put us into the biomedicine department. So they're kind of used as a vehicle to move around and connect to different departments. That's me working with a team of collaborators, educators from QUT. Greg down the bottom, he's been doing curriculum design for over 20 years, so he's got a lot of experience, and he's there to try to map this behavior to a curriculum, because it starts off, it's actually a little bit of a free-for-all. We do an open call. We have the platform of Ars Electronica. It's the festival in September, and all we say is that something's going to the festival in September. That's a given. That's a known. But it's actually just thrown out there, and we didn't know how it was going to go in the first instance, but it has been actually fairly successful. And again, I think it's, from my perspective, it's the art that provides the motivation, but it's also not just the art. I think that Ars Electronica provides a very nice perspective on art, which also connects and inspires those from the science and technology. So this was 2017, and already by 2018, the discipline spread is emerging further. But we would really like to start to get more of the, I would say, the hard science, the biological science in there. So again, that's the kind of approach we're now taking. My clock stopped, so I'm a little bit behind. I'll just try to run through a few of these last slides. So again, this is coming back to the model and how it's applied, and this is all built on actual projects, case studies that come from work, and then we create a structure based around that, and we experiment. This is particularly interesting, which we do in this case with dancers, but we're looking for other techniques which just try to help to get people out of their particular mindset and enter into a different space. I'm going to jump over these slides. These are just project examples from the Future Lab and how they're mapped. but most importantly, this is kind of what it's about, that in the initial stages, the first kind of 7 weeks of the program, we're more like guiding the collaboration, and we're just trying to get the people to think collectively, and then ideally find a space where there's even like a bit of a collective intuition, which normally starts to happen once the projects are rolling forward. This idea of collective imagination, collective intuition, this also comes from a close collaborator Maria Jose Sanchez, who's sitting here in the audience, who's, from the time I've kind of met her and her interest in phenomenology and this idea of and how we knowledge, I'm finding really interesting also of how I can apply this to some of our academic frameworks and pursuits, which is really resonating well with our academic partners. So I'm going to jump over this one. Just to describe some of the outputs, I think I'm just going to talk about this one-to-one. This is a dancer, Jacob. This is a very complex cinematic robot machine that a guy who was an ex-filmmaker created for his passion to continue filmmaking, but because he'd hurt his back really badly, he was not able to pursue the craft the way he used to. But he also comes from a strong engineering background. And the question that came out of the initial stages was this idea of how do we become more human. So basically, I'll just summarize very shortly. It's a performance with Jacob trying to communicate to this AI robot what it means to have a human body. So again, there's a lot of sort of phenomenological undertones there. And then the audience is absorbing this. And there's a video which I won't have time to play, and how the audience is responding to this afterwards. This is, for me, one of the critical areas of trying to understand different approaches to deep learning and how we tend to think about our own intelligence and then mirroring this into the idea of creating that intelligence, but also trying to kind of connect people with the idea of how important their own bodies are as part of your whole experience of how we learn, how we gather knowledge, and the world around us. Some of the things that Chris, who presented earlier today, was also talking about. So a great project that also continues to do very well, as many of the other projects have done. So I'm out of time. These are great robotic projects that I was going to show. Just to mention that QUT recently employed a new professor, Professor Louis-Philippe Demers. Great project, The Blind Robot, very intimate work where you're in a space with these robot arms that are coming feeling your face. And I think, again, it's a massive credit to the relationship that we've had with QUT and how they started with this experiment, but they're really pursuing quite further into this space with this idea of the importance of art. And it's a very strong institution dedicated to technology, to the science and the engineering. This is like a bit of a throwback onto some of the things that I was saying before, and this is very contextual. This is very important in the work in Australia. So the chief scientist in Australia, but the most important person in terms of scientific, legislative research and policy, met with Horst Hortner, the director of the Future Lab, a few years ago in Linz, and talked to him a lot about what he also put into a report, which is this idea of social impact and how we have to find better ways to bring that kind of the notion of our science into the general public. And again, it's not to discredit the value of the tradition of academic research. It's still so important, but we need to find other ways and other mechanisms, both in my opinion and I think growing across a whole number of other fields and experts, to do more of this kind of thing where you actually can create cycles of high-level research going into the world and back out of the world and back into the research, so on and so forth, similar to what I was showing before with the Mercedes project. And just to wrap up, this is a quote from Horst as a presentation he did at the Times Higher Education University Summit a few years ago for young universities under 50. And it's really clearly positioning where we're also coming from with Ars Electronica. And I think from a personal perspective, have to also underline this. Many of the talks I've seen the last few days have also touched on this. We saw, sorry, I just got to check to the reference, Juan Claudio's talk about climate change, and there's no question anymore that 100% of scientists can agree this is a result of human behavior. So why is it in a country like Australia, people are still, most of the voters are still more concerned about the cost of their electricity bill than the future of their children or the next generations when it comes to issues to do with coal power? If I think about Christopher's talk this morning, I think that's fairly clear. Why do we make the decisions and the bad decisions that we make? What do we need as also science to be able to create better mechanisms to communicate to the people? And how can we enable people more to have more of an effect and input into their own world? How can we empower people and encourage people to actually change their habits, because it's going to affect the future and it's going to have an impact? And what is the cultural context? So I'm not here now to say, you know, you have to do this, Mexico, and go and act, because I'm not from Mexico, and it would be very arrogant for me to do so. But you know, these are great examples. This is right next door. You know, to solve this problem, it takes an incredibly complex approach that requires expertise from a very big range. But at the end of the day, even if you do that and you fix this problem, it actually comes down to the human condition. It's about habits, and you have to change those habits, whether that's in Mexico or in Australia or in Asia or anywhere else. I'll just finish on this video. Again, just because of that context, several incredible women from Indonesia who took an approach to solving the issues to do with soil pollution.
The vision of this project is to inspire a lot of women in Indonesia. They can do this process in their own kitchen, so they don't have to go out from their home.
With the soya culture, I think it's the best way for me to explore the design and the textile at home.
So again, I'll wrap it up and I send links, but just a fantastic project and how it had this kind of effect, and it went, you know, it's into the daily life. It's like anyone with this right toolkit can basically do that in the kitchen, and they single-handedly create a solution to a massive problem that was being developed in their cultural context. So thanks very much. I just wanted to finish with saying a special thanks to Manolo Cocho, who unfortunately isn't here, but he's also the reason that I came. He's very interested to develop more art and science collaborative programs. I'm personally very interested to work with him, and I think as a result that means I'm very interested to work with the centre here. It's a very important aspect to what Ars Electronica is doing. It's not so much looking for, you know, the right partners from an economic perspective, but very much finding the right partners that are on the same page length and have the same interests, and how we can develop projects with researchers to really kind of, again, focus on this human-centric social impact space. So thanks again for all the people from C3. If you want to get in contact with me, or if you're interested to hear more about that, then I suggest just to get in contact with Manolo through Max or Laura or anybody else. So thanks a lot, and yeah, great to be here.
We have time for a few questions.
I'm a bit interested in what's the idea of your project of research for your PhD? What are you trying to do in this context of what you're doing in Ars Electronica?
So there's a lot of research happening around transdisciplinarity at the moment. There's an incredible lot of research which is going into theorizing about what it is, and then I think several years often of work to try and develop a curriculum based around that theory. With what I'm doing with the universities and my research and the model is we're just jumping in, and we're doing it, and we're learning from what's actually happening, and the results seem to speak for themselves that it's having an impact and they're changing in this way. I think again it comes down to, I think, this relationship to the notion of something that is very complex. It's complexity in how all these different systems are moving, and you know, at least from the context of Australian universities, they're all different in other ways, but there are commonalities that don't change. I mean, the financial economic structures inside the university are very difficult to break. And they're structures that have been built and are in place over hundreds of years. So that's at least where I think it can be useful. My principal supervisor, Richard Vella, is the former head of the School of Music, Drama and Fine Art. He was vehemently opposed to the idea of the creative industries model. I think the creative industries model is actually a backward step to this approach, where you're actually further compartmentalizing the idea of, everything that's art and creative we'll just put over there. And in some universities in Australia, over there means like 10 kilometres away from where the science engineering is happening. So I think that at least my research, and by just focusing on pulling off case studies directly that are coming out of this very different style of research institute, can have an incredible impact. That's on the one hand with universities, but more and more now we're getting a lot of interest from other industry partners, and also in Australia there seems to be this exhaustion around the idea of the design thinking. There's a massive amount of people out there that are experts in design thinking, but for me design thinking, it does the same, it has the same issue that creative industries does. You can't just contain all of creativity into that space. To reference a great artist I like here in Mexico, Arcángeles Constantini, when I met with him last time, we talked about the idea of, it doesn't matter how you want to define art, and I don't really choose to. That's why I use art thinking as a metaphor. I don't even want to bother trying to describe that, except to say that at least all art needs to be critical. It's about critique, and it has to have the ultimate freedom to be critical, even in and of itself. And I think it's a really important thing to understand and to grasp, which is very different to this sort of design thinking methodology, which I think is not only replicated in the context of this sort of industry and business movement. I think we see design thinking employed across a whole range of activities, and I think there's a desire for that to change. There's a desire to broaden that perspective. It's not to eliminate design thinking. As you can see in my diagram, they complement each other, but you cannot contain this other thing, whatever it's called, I just call it art thinking, in those contexts.
I'm curious, what kind of program at the university is hosting this peculiar research project to you for the PhD?
So my PhD was, again, the man I just mentioned, Richard Vella, who's still the chair of music at the university in Newcastle, Australia. He created the program, and to do it, he made that little research institute in Austria an adjunct campus. So most of my research happened there. And he also made Horst Hortner, the director of the Future Lab, an adjunct professor. So that's on the one hand. On the other, the QUT, that was because of a relationship we developed very early through a few people there, but it quickly escalated to the vice chancellor, so it went all the way up to the top. Peter Coldrake is his name. He's a fantastic guy. He's recently retired after 16 years at QUT. And that was also very important about those projects we were doing, because it was a top-down thing, and the faculties just had to fall in line. It's coming from above. So, but I think that's if you reference the name Peter Coldrake, he's written a lot about future education. He's for those who know Chuck Feeney, probably some of you do. He's the most, I think, famous philanthropist, American-Irish education philanthropist. Chuck Feeney was funding Peter Coldrake's activities at QUT. So I don't know if that had a little bit to do with the activities we were involved in, but again, it just came down to meeting the right people and having the right relationships.
Yeah, because it's not usual.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. I got a question about you said in one point that you accept or you prefer somebody with a strong disciplinary background who came to this cooperation.
Yeah.
In the same time, you see, you can say that artists, when they have strong backgrounds about ideology of contemporary art, have their own issues about criticism. For example, you see, maybe it's superficial in this way, one of the issue in art criticism about reflection of, about function of art It's about criticism about the sort of spectacles that we are living in, and we had to deal. Many of your projects were spectacular. It's a little bit against some of the issue the contemporary art tried to solve. So, for me, they are not only optimists, there are some dangers. The art as so can lose certain points of this criticism in this kind of cooperation. You see that there are some gains, but some losses.
Absolutely.
In this cooperation.
Yep. Thanks for the statement and the question. Again, I can only show a small subsection. I did concentrate on things that were much more heavy in terms of the science and the technology. We do and have for many years, we work with the absolute highest forms of art. We've done many cooperations with full orchestras. More recently with LA Philharmonic. We have at the festival every year since the beginning, the big concert night on the Sunday night, which is with the full Bruckner Orchestra. And I guess in that context of one form of art, an artistic expression, and also coming from a family in terms of my Belarusian background, I have a lot of relatives that are orchestra musicians, and I don't think there's a stronger example of a dedication to the art than, learning the craft of an instrument for 5 hours a day since you're, 4 years old. So it's very deeply embedded, at least in our approach. I remember I had this conversation with Max. I think that you need to be quite careful also about the type of work that you bring in that can not only really appeal to the science and the tech side, you have to appeal to the art side. You've got to have the right mix. And to quote who I think is a real leader in the field, Victoria Vesna, who's from UCLA, she established these first programs with the California Nano Institute of Technology, and her art, which is, from my perspective, on a super high level. And when I met her last time in California, and I sat in one of her classes, and she said that it's like good sci-fi. It has to be based on good science, but it still has to be a good film. It has to have all of the ingredients of the right craft. And I think that that's really important in terms of good sci art. And at the same time, it's like a lot of this stuff, we're still just at the, I would say, I think it developed, which some might describe as a bit of a renaissance, but it's still in many areas still in a very early immature stage. So it's like, anything that you do, even if you've got someone who's really trained at writing stories, doesn't mean they can write a good story. This is, part of the challenge. And then, of course, I think on reflection, to the point of art, I think this is also part of the challenge that I personally face, and I have to also work very hard, is that there's a whole portion of art that's created its own institution, I think its own barriers that they also need to open up a little bit if we're really going to be able to explore. But, I think it's just about touching the right nerves. And, I think as maybe a bit of a dangerous generalization, I feel that, the artists themselves should and generally do promote this idea of, ethical, responsibility. And I think that, again, with some of the bigger issues we face, it's obvious that things, we have to change and we have to open up. That would be my perspective anyway.
Thanks for this presentation. I was wondering, looking at all these, big teams of people and computers and robots, dancers, professional scientists, professional dancers, it seems that you guys, you have an idea and sky is the limit, don't you have sometimes projects rejected because you don't have the money, or it's like,
probably at least 20 per week.
Yes, okay. If you're an artist or a scientist, it happens all the time. You have these ideas and you can just not perform them or go along your ideas because the money is not there. So it seems that. So I know it's a presentation and it sounds like a success story and well, whatever we want to play with, we have it and we just play. Is it true, or is it?
No, not at all. Actually, again, it was a bit rushed, but in the model, you'll see this definable point. This is a spark. And then on the other side, and this other model that I'm looking at is trying also to map the many, there is like over 600 projects, which are quite well produced and everything, but for any one of them, there's maybe 5 or more sparks that never really eventuate. Or with any one project, we may often have several that start to go out, and maybe most of them are dropped, or very often there might be a bit of an amalgamation because there's some interesting ideas there or here. But I do think what's very interesting about Ars Electronica as a model, and why I'm now using this in Australia, and just incidentally, it's not a franchise. I'm an independent, and we call it an organism. It's growing, but it's drawing on this ethos. So whatever they're doing, and I think in the same way that I at least feel a good scientist does through the process of experimentation, you have to kind of make the decisions and calls on where your research may go. I think it's probably something you could relate to if you've got a certain amount of research funding. There might be like a very clear strategy you have to follow, but ideally you also would like the space just to be able to kind of play. Otherwise, where do you get that opportunity? It's not always easy. The video I started to play was based on what we call the experimental workshop series. It was a 2-year project I did with an Indian UK-based dancer. And we had to get the funding in drips and drabs. We had an initial experimental workshop, which was a whole week, and it takes that long just to get the dancer. And in this case, we had our theoretical physicist, who's a very, very great programmer, involved, and brought in an electrical engineer. We also had our content producer / he's coming from narrative storytelling, a whole bunch of people, and just start to get them used to being in the space together. The funding was already gone, and we didn't have any clue. A few questions, though. Then we had some nice documentation, and then we take that away, and our partners took that away, and they were able to get more funding and so on. It was almost 2 years, and then now it's a fully international touring dance work. But it may have just started and stopped there, and that's all it was. The dancer got money from the British Arts Council because he wanted to explore using technology in his craft. So sometimes it's, there's a lot of projects and work we do which are just that. It's basically a research in that kind of experimentation, and it doesn't really follow through. I don't know if that answers your question well enough. Yeah.
Okay. The quick way to follow up
is, do you have any example of experimentation that was really cheap?
Oh yeah.
So we saw like very expensive shows basically. But do you have something like?
Yeah, no, look, there's there's stuff I could have shown others which are on the one hand very cheap, because what you also have at Ars Electronica is we have an incredible toolkit. It's an incredible atelier. It's a laboratory that extends to 3 or 4 massive warehouses with heaps of screens and Arduinos and computers and cables and all that kind of stuff. So maybe all we kind of need is the inkling of an idea. And there's a lot of stuff that happens at the Ars Electronica Festival, by the way, which is like that. You'll see the really sort of highly curated stuff, and then you'll just see a whole bunch of stuff which is very experimental and still in the process. And similar for what happens in the museum, it's a little bit different, but also the last few years we've been having a portion of the festival which is just called the Open Future Lab, and where, as much as possible, sometimes we can't because of our industry, like NDAs, but we just open up some of that stuff. So there is, particularly in the Future Lab, there's often just play. The way it functions is the Ars Electronica gets a lot of public funding, but it only goes to the centre, the museum, and to the festival. The Future Lab has to cover its costs year to year. So that's what I mentioned from the industry funds. But once we've covered our kind of resources and our costs, then, usually there's time left. And that is actually time for the researchers that have as part of their allocated hours, time just to do whatever. And that there may not be money for that, but they can just experiment with something because they're interested in a particular type of technology, or we do have some budget just to buy some base technologies to play around with. But, the dance piece, the most complicated piece of that performance, was a very old printer drawer that was pulled out. It had a motor attached to it and an Arduino, and it sat above the stage, and every time you hit a space bar, a piece of paper flew out. And by the end of it, there were thousands of pieces of paper and ventilator fans that were making a tornado of paper that created that effect. And that was less than $100. You know, we may have thousands of dollars of tracking equipment around, but you know, it's actually a combination of both old and new. And I think that's probably the same in science. You're not only just looking for the cutting edge tech, how can you reuse some of the old stuff in different ways? So, yeah.
Well, it seems that there are no more questions. So with this, we have come to the end of the third week of Complexity. It was great. I would like to thank all of you for staying with us, all the invited speakers for their time, the beautiful talks, the commitment, and all the telecommunication team. They are there in the back doing their job. Laura, Santiago, Ruben, the organizers, and all the staff of the center who made possible this event. And let's thank Christina again.